5 navies, dozens of warships, gone within 72 hours. It was one of the worst naval disasters in modern history. And almost no one talks about it. Allied forces from America, Britain, the Netherlands, and Australia joined in a desperate alliance to stop Japan's unstoppable advance in the Pacific. It was supposed to be a line in the sand. But instead, they sailed straight into a meticulously planned ambush. Outgunned, outnumbered, and hopelessly outmatched, ship by ship, the Allied fleet was picked apart many without ever seeing what hit them. Commanders lost, fleets shattered, and entire vessels swallowed by the sea, some disappearing so completely that even today, their wrecks are just gone. So how did one of the biggest multinational fleets in World War II history vanish almost overnight? And how did Japan manage to erase it so completely with barely a scratch of their own? This is the shocking true story behind the Battle of the Java Sea and the brutal days that followed. Section 1. The Allied fleet that was never ready. They called it ABDA, short for the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command. On paper, it was an unprecedented alliance. Ships from 4 Allied powers coming together under a single command to hold the line against Japan's terrifying momentum across Southeast Asia. But behind that bold acronym was chaos, confusion, and desperation. Each navy brought its own ships, its own tactics, and most importantly, its own language. Imagine trying to fight a coordinated sea battle when one bridge crew is shouting orders in English, the flagship is speaking Dutch, and the Australians are trying to translate both. In the middle of live combat, those differences turned into lethal vulnerabilities. This wasn't a united fleet. It was a patchwork circus of aging warships, leftover World War I destroyers, and cruisers already limping from earlier battles. By early 1942, Japan's war machine was slicing across the Pacific like a blade. They'd already captured Hong Kong, Malaysia, and swarmed across the Philippines. They bombed Darwin and turned it into a ruin. They'd taken Borneo, the Celebes, and now they were coming for Java, what the Dutch called the beating heart of their East Indies empire. And the Allies? Still scrambling. ABDA's commander, Admiral Thomas C. Hart, had already gone home, disillusioned and frustrated by the fractured command structure. In his place stood Rear Admiral Karel Doorman, a Dutch officer respected for his courage but now tasked with leading ships and sailors who didn't even share the same naval doctrines. Worse yet, his fleet was hopelessly outmatched in almost every category that mattered. Japan's fleet was fast, modern, and lethal. They had state-of-the-art optics for gunnery, advanced rangefinders, superior training, and perhaps most terrifying of all, the Long-Lance torpedo. A weapon so advanced, most Allied sailors didn't even know what it was until it tore through their hulls from miles away. In contrast, the ABDA fleet consisted of 2 heavy cruisers, HMS Exeter and USS Houston. Houston's rear turret had already been knocked out by an earlier air raid, and Exeter was showing her age. 3 light cruisers, the Dutch ships De Ruyter and Java, and the Australian cruiser HMAS Perth. Lighter firepower, less armor. 9 destroyers, pulled from every corner of the map, many of them under-equipped, under-trained, or simply out of ammunition. Doorman's flagship De Ruyter didn't even carry torpedoes. Let that sink in. In a theater of war dominated by torpedo duels, Doorman's flagship cruiser literally had none. It was a political move. The Dutch had historically viewed torpedoes as unpredictable and unsporting. But it meant that in the fast-moving chessboard of naval warfare, De Ruyter was playing without a queen. Communications were another disaster waiting to happen. The Dutch fleet signaled primarily with flares and flags. The Americans used shortwave radio. The British followed their own rigid codes and procedures. In the heat of battle, or even just trying to maneuver across an open sea, these differences weren't just inconvenient, they were deadly. And yet, with everything stacked against them, the Allies still tried to fight. You have to understand the mindset of the era. This wasn't just about holding territory, it was about holding pride. The Dutch were already watching their entire East Indies colonial empire unravel. The Americans had suffered a brutal humiliation at Pearl Harbor, followed by the rapid collapse in the Philippines. The British had just lost Prince of Wales and repulsed their pride of the Pacific. And the Australians? They knew that without Java, the road to their own mainland would be wide open. They knew they were going to bleed. But they still hoped somehow to stop the bleeding before it became fatal. The Japanese, meanwhile, weren't just advancing, they were rehearsing. Their fleets had drilled relentlessly in the South China Sea. Their torpedo teams could hit targets in the dark, and their cruisers practiced coordinated salvos that mimicked ideal ambush formations. This was not a try-your-luck operation. This was a calculated sweep, executed by one of the finest naval forces assembled up to that point in the war. Rear Admiral Takeo Takagi, commanding the Japanese center force, was a veteran tactician. Unlike Abda's fractured command, his subunits moved like clockwork. Every destroyer knew its lane. Every cruiser had range and angle pre-plotted, and most importantly, they weren't rushing. Takagi didn't want a chaotic showdown. He wanted a clean kill. And then, the bait was set. On February 27th, 1942, a warning came in. Japanese transport ships were approaching Java. A full-scale invasion was moments away. Doorman's orders were simple: intercept the convoy and stop the landings. Make no mistake, if those troops landed, Japan would control Java, the crown jewel of the Dutch colonial empire, and secure one of the most vital oil-rich regions on Earth. Doorman didn't hesitate. He gave the order. His mixed fleet of cruisers and destroyers steamed north from Surabaya to intercept the Japanese force. But there were two things he didn't know. First, the Japanese transports were traveling with a heavy escort, much heavier than any Allied intelligence had predicted. Multiple groups of destroyers and 2 heavy cruisers, Nachi and Haguro, armed to the teeth with 10 powerful 8-inch guns each and dozens of the feared long-lance torpedoes. And second, the Japanese were already watching him. A floatplane launched from Nachi had spotted the Abda fleet almost immediately after it departed. For the entire day, the plane shadowed Doorman's movements, radioing back positions, direction, and formation. That single floatplane changed everything. With this recon advantage, the Japanese didn't just prepare for a fight, they designed the battlefield. As Doorman advanced, his adversaries were already tightening the net. Cruisers moved to optimal firing range. Destroyers fanned out in concentric arcs, and overhead, swarms of Japanese aircraft stood ready to isolate and punish any escape attempts. What Doorman thought was a surprise intercept was actually the beginning of an elaborate multi-stage trap, and the first signs of collapse were already showing. As the fleet pushed north, small Dutch scout planes were launched, and almost immediately overwhelmed by Japanese fighters. In just minutes, the skies were cleared of Allied eyes. Now, Doorman was blind while Takagi had a bird's-eye view of every move. By now, some in the Allied fleet had begun to sense the scale of what they were up against. USS Houston's logbooks recorded the mood on board as increasingly grim. Sailors whispered that something was off, that they were being led into something. Oilers were running low. Many destroyers were nearly out of torpedoes from previous engagements, and critically, nobody really knew what the endgame was. Did Doorman intend to attack the convoy? Or the escorts? Or push through and attempt a nighttime assault? No one could say for sure, because as clear as Doorman's bravery was, his communication strategy was almost non-existent. His orders were vague, his regrouping signals unclear, his multilingual signals misunderstood. Some formations were repositioning mid-ocean simply because they thought they'd missed a command, when in reality, there was none. And so, the fleet marched into the Java Sea, hopeful, but hopelessly fractured beneath the surface. It's easy to judge with hindsight, to say they were doomed. But in truth, they probably already knew it. You don't sail second-rate ships into a superior enemy force and expect to come out victorious. But they did it anyway. And that's what makes the next part of this story even more haunting. Because despite everything, the miscommunication, the outdated ships, the failing coordination, and the literal miles of torpedo danger ahead, Doorman still believed they could turn the tide. And for a few fleeting moments, so did his men. Section 2. The trap is set, and they sail right into it. The Java Sea was calm, the sun was high, and the Allied fleet steamed forward with a strange kind of silence. They thought they were hunting a convoy. What they didn't realize was that the convoy was bait. From the moment Admiral Doorman turned his ships northeast from Surabaya, each move they made was tracked. Not once, not twice, but continuously. Overhead, hidden high in cloud cover, a Japanese floatplane from the heavy cruiser Nachi followed every twist and turn. Its pilot didn't shoot, didn't interfere. He just watched and reported. And as Doorman's ships blindly advanced, Japanese Admiral Takeo Takagi was already preparing his strike. But this wouldn't be a traditional engagement. From the very beginning, the Japanese plan was surgical. What Doorman had was a strike force, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers, a mix of American, British, Dutch, and Australian ships. What Takagi had was precision warfare. His fleet wasn't just stronger, it was coordinated, streamlined, and deeply rehearsed. Takagi split his forces into 2 main groups. The Central Escort Force, led by the heavy cruisers Haguro and Nachi, backed by the destroyers Yamakaze, Kawakaze, Sazanami, and Ushio. These were the main guns of the operation, powerful, accurate, and bristling, with long-lance torpedoes capable of hitting targets over 20 kilometers away. The southern screen under Rear Admiral Nishimura included light cruisers Jinsu and Naka, supported by destroyers like Udachi, Murasame, Minagumo, Asagumo, and more. They were the flankers, fast, agile, and tasked with overwhelming the Allied destroyer screen. They were positioned not in a defensive wall, but like a tightening net drawn wide across the Java Sea, slowly closing in. From high above, the Japanese commander could literally see the Abda fleet cruising right into the pocket. And the best part, from their perspective, Dorman had no idea. His ships sailed in broad daylight. They weren't stealthy, they weren't covered by friendly aircraft. And thanks to outdated radar and limited reconnaissance, they had an almost zero understanding of what lay ahead. Back on De Ruyter, the tension was rising. Mixed messages crackled across ship radios. Allied destroyers were trying to confirm formation sizes, enemy sightings, and fuel status. A few US vessels were down to their last torpedo spreads. Some of the Dutch ships couldn't communicate at all over wireless. Signals were going out via flags and blinking lights technology better suited to 1916 than 1942. And yet, despite the disorganization, Dorman pressed forward. Shortly after 3:30 p.m. on February 27th, the Japanese had eyes on the Allied group, Amatsukaze, a destroyer under Captain Tamechi Hara himself. One of the few Japanese officers to survive the entire Pacific War, was the first to confirm visual contact. The Allied force, previously an abstraction on a map, was now clearly visible. Hara raised his binoculars and focused. He could spot the unmistakable starboard profile of De Ruyter, Houston, Exeter. It was the entire Abda strike group, and they were dead in the water metaphorically, charging forward at full steam. Utterly unaware they were being lured into the jaws of the finest naval ambush Japan had staged all war. At nearly the same moment, Allied spotters aboard Electra noticed flashes on the horizon, first enemy sighting, about 16,000 yards out. A line of low-slung shapes hugging the water, enemy cruisers. The Japanese were here. Dorman now had a decision to make, retreat or charge head-on, and he didn't hesitate. He turned to engage, but already, he was too late to control the board. Japanese destroyers had begun to close the range. Jinsu, leading the Japanese vanguard, turned sharply, charging forward with a wolf pack of destroyers at her rear. Yukikaze, Tokitsukaze, Amatsukaze, and Hatsukaze. On board Electra, spotters yelled contact. The Allies opened fire. The gunfight was chaotic. Electra, alongside Houston and Perth, fired the first salvos. Tall columns of water shot from the ocean's surface as 5 and 8-inch shells crashed down, none hitting their mark. From the Japanese side, Naka and her destroyers launched the first torpedo spread. At 15,000 yards, it was a distant shot. Cold numbers later revealed 43 torpedoes were unleashed in that opening volley. All of them missed. But the point wasn't to hit right away, it was to force movement to scatter the Allied formation, provoke chaos, and open up holes in their lines. And it worked. At 4:15 p.m., Haguro entered the scene. Unlike the other ships, Haguro was a veteran killer. Her gunners zeroed in on Dorman's flagship De Ruyter, and within minutes, an 8-inch shell tore open her auxiliary motor room. Flames roared through the port side. Power flickered. Men died instantly in the blast. Another shell from Nachi slammed into Houston, puncturing her stern and detonating near an oil tank, driving flames up the ventilation shafts. And still, De Ruyter kept charging. Japanese destroyers swarmed. Electra fired again, this time scoring a hit on Tokitsukaze, blowing thick smoke skyward. For a brief moment, it looked like the Allies would punch through the screen, but then it started to unravel. Haguro redirected her fire from De Ruyter to Exeter, the British heavy cruiser. Long-range shells walked themselves ever closer, salvo by salvo, and with one deafening blast, an 8-inch shell slammed into Exeter's engine room. 6 of her 8 boilers were instantly destroyed. The ship slowed to 5 knots. Water poured in, crews scrambled. The entire Allied line behind her practically folded as ship after ship banked to avoid colliding with the limping cruiser. Perth, Houston, and Java broke formation thinking an order had been given. It hadn't. Doorman was still charging, alone for several minutes, before realizing the rest of the fleet had peeled off. What followed was chaos. Houston and other ships fired torpedoes to cover Exeter's retreat. British destroyers Electra encountered Jupiter rushed to her defense, laying down dense clouds of smoke to hide the crippled cruiser. Japanese gunners adjusted quickly. Haguro's next strike came not from her guns, but her torpedo tubes. At a staggering 22,000 yards more than 12 miles away, Haguro launched 8 torpedoes. One of them struck. It hit the Dutch destroyer Kortenaer square amidships. The explosion was so massive that the ship tore itself in half. Within minutes, Kortenaer sank, taking 66 men with her. A fluke shot at a historic range, what some naval historians believe may have been the longest-range torpedo hit in naval history. And still, the Allies pressed on. Back in the destroyer duel, Asagumo and Electra clashed at point-blank range. Shells screamed across the water. Electra landed multiple hits, a show of unexpected precision, but suffered catastrophic damage in return. One Japanese shell ripped through her engine room, killing propulsion. Another blast destroyed her radio room, silencing her completely. Fire raced across her deck. Turret after turret went down. Kaput. Lifeless. The crew tried to abandon ship, swimming through fire and fuel, but Asagumo and Minagumo gave them no quarter. They continued to fire until Electra slipped beneath the water forever. And then the smoke began to clear. 2 Allied ships sunk, 1 crippled, others damaged, and most disturbingly, they hadn't even reached the invasion convoy. Doorman, still intent on pushing forward, called for a retreat, but not in the way most commanders would. This was not surrender. This was delay. His objective had never changed. The convoy, the troop ships, they had to be stopped. As evening fell, the Allied ships reversed course, retreating toward Surabaya. Admiral Takagi saw it differently. From his flagship Nachi, he believed the retreat meant victory. His forces rearmed, reformed, and assumed Doorman was withdrawing for good. But he wasn't. Darkness fell. And as the sun dipped below the waves, Doorman made a decision no one expected. He was going back in. Section 3. The night the ocean turned black. The sun was gone, now swallowed by the edge of the Java Sea. But what replaced it was worse. Darkness. Thick, choking, all-consuming night. And somewhere in the blackness, the enemy waited, watching, listening, ready to strike. After nearly 2 hours of combat, the Abda fleet had been left bloodied and scattered. 2 destroyers were gone. Exeter was wounded and barely keeping afloat. The flagship De Ruyter had taken multiple hits, and the oxygen-starved corridors of nearly every cruiser now reeked of smoke, oil, and sweat. Most commanders would have turned back, declared the operation a loss, saved what remained. But Admiral Carol Doorman wasn't most commanders. Despite the punishing losses, he hadn't been swayed from his mission. The Japanese troop convoy was still moving toward Java. If those ships landed, Java would fall, and with it, the Dutch East Indies. Doorman had already lost ships, sailors, and critical time, but his objective hadn't changed. "I will attack," he reportedly declared, and this time, under the cover of night, he made his final push. Abda's last march. As the crippled Exeter limped towards Surabaya to escape with Wittidawith trailing as escort, Doorman's remaining force reformed into a rough line. What he had left was this: 3 cruisers, De Ruyter, flagship, Java, and Perth. 1 heavy cruiser, USS Houston, still damaged but willing to fight. 2 operational destroyers, HMS Jupiter and HMS Encounter. 4 American destroyers, John D. Edwards, John D. Ford, Alden, and Paul Jones, which were seconds from withdrawal. The problem wasn't just damage, it was ammunition. Many destroyers had fired every torpedo they had during the day's battle. Others were low on fuel, communications were patchy at best. And by now, every sailor aboard knew they were pushing their luck. Still, just after nightfall, Doorman gave the order, advance. At roughly 9:15 p.m., the 4 American destroyers peeled off. They'd done what they could, but now, with no torpedoes and critically low fuel, they had no way to continue. Doorman let them go. Then came the first omen. At approximately 9:25 p.m., HMS Jupiter abruptly exploded. No torpedoes, no enemy contact, just an earth-shaking detonation mid-hull that sheared the destroyer apart. The immediate assumption was that she'd been struck by a Japanese mine. But later reports would reveal something far more bitter. The minefield was Dutch. Jupiter had been sunk by her own side. 84 crewmen were killed instantly. The rest abandoned ship into total darkness. No rescue was possible. None was attempted. The mission pressed on, now down to a single destroyer, HMS Encounter. Dorman's force moved cautiously into open water. Then something visible in the blackness bobbing figures. Men in the waves. They were the crew of Courtenay, sunk hours earlier by one of Haguro's torpedoes. Dorman ordered Encounter to slow and pick up survivors. 113 men were recovered, but at a price. The moment Encounter turned south for home, Dorman had no remaining destroyer escort. None. Only 4 cruisers remained, vulnerable and unsupported, moving through blackness like ghosts. They weren't alone. Japan's eyes in the sky. Unseen above, Haguro's float plane continued tracking Dorman's fleet. Until now, Takagi had assumed Dorman had withdrawn completely. He hadn't. As the float plane confirmed contact, a surge of radio traffic lit up on Nachi's bridge. Enemy force returning. Repeat enemy returning to the field. Takagi's reaction wasn't panic, it was precision. Immediately, Haguro and Nachi, the same cruisers that had dominated the daylight battle, were ordered to intercept. They didn't light searchlights. They didn't fire their guns. Instead, under cover of night, they began preparing a stealthy operation, a torpedo strike silent, coordinated, and launched from over 10 miles away. They wouldn't even need to be seen. The attack that broke Abda. It was shortly before midnight, February 27th, 1942, when Dorman's cruisers moved up the west coast of Java. They passed through the very sea where Courtenay, Electra, and Jupiter now rested beneath the waves. Lights were extinguished. Guns were readied. Lookouts scanned the horizon through the bottomless dark and saw nothing. Then, at exactly 11:32 p.m., alarms began to ring out aboard Java. White streaks in the water, torpedoes headed straight for her port side. She didn't have time to evade. One of Nachi's torpedoes slammed into her rear quarter, right below the aft magazine. For 1 second, there was steel. The next, pure fire. An enormous explosion ruptured the back of the ship. A mushroom of flame curled high into the night sky. 100 feet of stern tore free. Windows shattered aboard the nearby De Ruyter from the sheer concussive force. Java rolled to starboard. 15 minutes later, she was completely gone. Of her crew, only 19 survived. Dorman didn't stop. There was no time. Before crews could even process Java's death, another wave of torpedoes arrived. This time from Haguro. And one of them was headed straight for De Ruyter. The final blow. The torpedo struck just behind the bridge. Power across the ship died immediately. The backup systems failed. Flooding began within moments. In the confusion, fires sparked in third-deck compartments, triggering secondary explosions. Worse, the damage control center had been among the first areas to flood, killing most of the response team in an instant. The few surviving crew scrambled to seal compartments, but without electricity or pumps, it was a losing battle. Admiral Dorman was last seen standing calmly on the bridge, issuing quiet orders as engineers tried to assess the damage. Messages were sent to the remaining cruisers to scatter. Later, Australian cruiser Perth would log the final radio message received from De Ruyter. "I am Zunk." The ship began listing heavily to port. Within minutes, seawater overtook the main deck and fires curled upward toward the command tower. At 2:30 a.m., De Ruyter slipped beneath the waves. 367 crewmen lost. Among them, Rear Admiral Carol Dorman, a man who had refused to retreat, refused to abandon his mission, and ultimately followed his fleet to the bottom of the sea. Roars in the darkness. On board Haguro and Nachi, the mood was electric. As the Allied ships exploded, crewmen watched with awe from the decks. Cheers erupted. Some leapt for joy. Cries of "Banzai" echoed above the water. It wasn't just victory, it was domination. Admiral Takagi ordered a ceasefire. The enemy was destroyed. The Haguro and Nachi turned away, not losing a single ship or taking even serious damage. The night was over. Dorman's fleet was finished. Retreat and regret. Back on board Houston and Perth, retreat was the only option. They turned south toward the port of Tanjung Priok, battered, low on fuel, and completely out of torpedoes. The other ships had either fled or vanished. Hours later, in the early morning, the battered Houston log would add a chilling phrase: No further signals received from Admiral Dorman. The ocean had been silenced. What comes next? Sailors on Houston and Perth believed for a moment that they had made it, that the worst was behind them. They were wrong. Less than 24 hours later, both would face a new disaster in the Sunda Strait, ambushed again, this time by the main Japanese invasion fleet. But the battle for the Java Sea? It was already lost. ABDA no longer existed. Its ships were either crippled, scattered, or sunk. And Dorman's dream of holding the line now rested at the bottom. Section 4. Death in the Sunda Strait. The Java Sea was behind them, along with the wreckage of an entire fleet. Admiral Dorman was gone. His flagship, De Ruyter, now rested on the seafloor. Java had exploded under a torpedo blast. Exeter was retreating, barely able to stay afloat. Most of the Allied escorts were already sunk or scattered. There were now only 2 combat-worthy Allied cruisers left in the Dutch East Indies, the heavy cruiser USS Houston and the Australian light cruiser HMAS Perth. They had survived the day, but they were sailing blind, damaged, and low on ammo straight into their final disaster. The wrong escape route. At first, it seemed like survival was possible. At 9 a.m. on February 28th, Houston and Perth limped into Tanjung Priok, the main port of Batavia, now Jakarta. Both ships were stained with smoke, their decks scorched, their crews exhausted. They needed fuel. Ammunition. A miracle. What they got was nothing. Oil stocks were running dangerously low. Ammunition for the main guns? Already used up or unavailable. Neither cruiser could even reload their torpedo tubes. What little supplies existed went to ground troops preparing for the Japanese invasion expected at any hour. And yet, the orders came down. Escape to Cilacap, a southern port still under Dutch control. To get there, they'd have to pass through the Sunda Strait, a narrow funnel between Java and Sumatra that they hoped was still open. It wasn't. A deadly miscalculation. Perth, under Captain Heck Waller, led the way. Behind her, Houston, commanded by Captain Albert Rooks. They departed at 7 p.m. that same night, unaware of what lay just ahead. The entire Japanese invasion fleet for West Java. What Dorman had tried and failed to intercept in the Java Sea had reached its destination. Almost 60 Japanese warships, cruisers, destroyers, troop transports were gathered across Bantam Bay, unloading battalions of troops just off the coast. But no one told Perth or Houston that. As they sailed west through the narrowing strait, visibility began to drop. The moonlight barely cut through mist. Navigation was careful. Orders were quiet. Then, at around 10:30 p.m., Perth's radar picked up multiple contacts. Just ahead, lights. Ships. A lot of them. At first, Waller assumed they were friendly or perhaps neutral merchant traffic. They weren't. The ambush unveiled. The first shells came in without warning. Japanese destroyers spotted the Allied cruisers moving straight into the bay and opened fire immediately. Rule number 1 of the Pacific War: never underestimate Japanese night warfare. They were masters of the art. Within seconds, Perth and Houston were illuminated by flares, targeted by long-range torpedoes, and surrounded by a vanguard of Japanese destroyers. Fubuki, Shirayuki, Asakaze, Harukase, and more. It was an ambush, but not one Japan had intended. Literally no one expected Houston and Perth to arrive, not even the Japanese. The Allied cruisers had just stumbled by sheer misfortune into the exact center of a 60-ship Japanese invasion fleet. Perth's final stand. Captain Waller ordered Perth into evasive maneuvers. Open fire, came the order. Perth's 6-inch guns lit up, engaging destroyers with everything she had left. At one point, she actually scored a direct hit on Shirayuki's bridge, temporarily stunning the command crew. But victory was impossible. At about 11:15 p.m., Perth was struck by a long-range torpedo below her forward engine room. She lost speed but kept firing. A minute later, another torpedo ripped through her bow, followed by 2 more amidships within a few minutes. Fires roared across her decks. Engines began to stall. Waller gave the order no captain ever wants to give. Abandon ship. Flames engulfed the forward sections as sailors leapt into the burning sea, some covered in oil, others already wounded. Within 20 agonizing minutes, HMAS Perth slipped below the surface. Out of over 680 men on board, more than 350 were killed. Captain Waller went down with the ship. Houston's last guns. Behind Perth, the USS Houston was fighting alone. Already damaged before the battle had even begun, her rear guns were still inoperable thanks to a previous attack near Darwin. She had no torpedoes, only limited shells, and constantly jammed AA guns. But Captain Albert Rooks refused to go quietly. As Perth went down, Houston targeted every visible ship-blasting destroyers left and right with her main batteries. She landed a few hits. She even set a small destroyer ablaze. For a moment, her crew believed they might be able to push through. Then, a spread of Japanese torpedoes slammed into her starboard side. Then the port. Then astern. Captain Rooks was last seen outside the conning tower, giving commands as the bridge exploded around him. He died in the blast. Still, his crew fought moaning steel with grit. They kept firing guns even as the ship listed hard. They tried to return fire through the smoke. Survivors would later describe streaks of fire, whistling shrapnel, the smell of burning insulation, and the sound of screaming metal before the final break. At 12:20 a.m. March 1st, USS Houston sank. Out of 1,061 crewmen, only 368 would survive almost all captured by Japanese ground forces in the hours after. Friendly fire catastrophe. In the chaos of the battle, Japan's own torpedoes made history in the worst way possible. One destroyer, targeting Perth, missed badly. The 24-inch torpedoes flew straight toward Bantam Bay, where Japanese convoy ships were anchored, still unloading troops. Sakura Maru, a Japanese transport, was hit and sunk. Shinshu Maru, a landing ship, blasted apart. Orai Maru, a hospital ship, torpedoed. Tatsuno Maru, another transport, disabled. Minesweeper W2, obliterated. In total, Japanese torpedoes accidentally destroyed 5 of their own ships, killing soldiers and sailors by the hundreds. In one of history's most ironic turns, Houston and Perth caused more damage to Japan through accidental friendly fire than they inflicted directly. The end of the Sunda Strait battle. As the sun rose hours later, the waters of Bantam Bay were slick with oil and flame. Perth and Houston were gone, troop transports were burning. Japanese sailors fished out corpses from their own vessels, shocked that the night had turned so bloody, but the mission was complete. The bulk of the Japanese invasion force landed successfully. West Java fell within days. Surabaya would crumble shortly after. The East Indies, once protected by the Abda fleet, were now completely in Japanese hands. HNLM's Evertsen, the forgotten casualty. There was one more Allied ship left from the ill-fated attempt to escape. The Dutch destroyer HNLMS Evertsen had left Tanjung Priok roughly 2 hours after Perth and Houston due to delays. By the time Evertsen approached the strait, the sea was glowing from burning oil and distant explosions. Her commander tried to skirt the coast and weave past the ambush. For a time, Evertsen managed to avoid Japanese destroyers. But not for long. She was eventually spotted and chased by Murakumo and Shirakumo, who opened fire immediately with 5-inch guns. Shell after shell crashed into the lightly armored destroyer, setting her ablaze. With no chance of survival, Evertsen's captain beached the destroyer onto a reef near Sabuku Island. It was the end. The final Allied vessel attempting escape was either sunk or scuttled. What was lost? In just 36 hours, from February 27 to March 1, Japan had destroyed an entire multinational fleet. Dozens of warships sunk. 5 nations humiliated. Thousands of sailors dead or captured. The entirety of the Dutch East Indies lost. ABDA as a command structure was dissolved. The Dutch Royal Navy was decimated, and the Allies, stunned and broken, fell back toward Australia. Only a few ships escaped the region entirely, and those that did would sail into a Pacific War that was just beginning. Section 5. The Hunt That Didn't Stop. The Abda fleet no longer existed. Its command had been shattered, its flagship gone beneath the waves. Its last cruisers hunted down and sunk at the Sunda Strait. But the war wasn't finished with the survivors. Because what came next wasn't a retreat. It was a relentless naval manhunt. What was left of the Abda fleet By the time the sun rose on March 1st, 1942, the Allied fleet in the East Indies was in total collapse. The Japanese had torn through every group they had encountered. Doorman's primary strike force wiped out. Perth and Houston lost at Sunda Strait. Evertson grounded and destroyed. But there were still a handful of warships at sea, some limping, some trying to escape across the vast Java Sea in hopes of reaching Australia or Ceylon. Among them, the heavily damaged HMS Exeter, escorted by HMS Encounter, USS Pope, and several submarines, destroyers, oilers, and supply ships attempting to scatter in every direction imaginable. They were slowing down, running low on fuel, barely communicating, and the Japanese were closing in from every side. Japanese intel, no escape. By this point in the war, Japanese naval intelligence was ruthlessly efficient. Floatplanes tracked Allied ships from the air, submarines intercepted outgoing convoys, and carriers shadowed every likely route to freedom. The death of Admiral Dorman didn't slow Japan down, it freed them to go on the offensive. On March 1, Japanese High Command issued one simple order: all remaining enemy vessels in the Java Sea are to be destroyed. Admiral Takagi, fresh off his victory at Java, charged full speed into a second operation. The hunt had begun. Exeter's final fight. The British cruiser HMS Exeter had barely survived the main Java Sea battle. Hit by Haguro, she'd lost most of her power days earlier and had limped into Surabaya for patchy repairs. Now, with patched boilers and minimal guidance, she was trying to escape west escorted by Pope and Encounter. They had almost made it halfway across the Java Sea when they were spotted. At 10 a.m. on March 1, Japanese scouts discovered them. And not just any scouts, but the cruisers Miyoko and Ashigara with a full destroyer screen. For nearly 2 hours, the Allied trio tried to flee. They dodged gunnery salvos. They dropped smoke. They zigzagged across the waves. It was no good. Sickeningly accurate 8-inch shells began hammering around Exeter. One round finally struck, ripping through what was left of her engine room, disabling all remaining propulsion. She began to drift. As Pope and Encounter tried to mount a defense, more Japanese ships arrived, including Haguro and Nachi, the same two predators that had crippled the fleet days earlier. Exeter stood no chance. She was eventually hit square in the electrical room, killing all power. Fire spread quickly across the decks. Ammunition was already gone. Turrets fell silent. Captain Oliver Gordon gave the order: "Scuttle the ship. All hands abandon." Exeter sank shortly after 1 p.m., flags still flying. Hundreds jumped into the sea. Most were captured. Some later died in captivity. Pope and Encounter. Final resistance. With Exeter gone, Pope and Encounter were left alone and hopeless. Encounter broke off to draw fire. Gun turrets overheated as she fought off multiple Japanese vessels. But a shell eventually struck below deck, disabling her steering. She was ripped apart under combined fire from half a dozen Japanese cruisers and destroyers. USS Pope, the last destroyer standing, tried to disappear into the thick smoke. And for a time, she did. She escaped radar detection for over an hour, dodging incoming salvos and hiding behind Pacific squalls. But the Japanese had another weapon: air power. Planes launched from the light carrier Ryujo spotted razor-thin movement under the clouds. 15 minutes later, Japanese dive bombers were circling overhead. Bombs tore into Pope's decks, splintering her hull amidships. Her rudder was disabled. Power failed. She began to list fires raging across the bridge. By mid-afternoon, Pope capsized and went under. On her final broadcast, her radio operator sent one last message: "We gave them everything we had." The subchase. USS Perch and K-916. Meanwhile, under the surface, desperate Allied submarines were also trying to flee the worsening disaster zone. One of these, USS Perch, had already been spotted days earlier. Two Japanese destroyers, Amatsukaze and Hatsukaze, hunted her relentlessly. They finally trapped her on March 3, lobbing charges for hours, followed by direct shell hits when Perch surfaced. She was crippled and scuttled by her own crew. A similar fate met the Dutch submarine K-16, cornered, attacked, forced to retreat to Surabaya. She was scuttled before capture. Even underwater, there was nowhere to hide. The scuttling of Surabaya. By March 4, Japanese land forces were moving into Surabaya, the last major Allied naval base in the East Indies. And what they found was eerie. A harbor full of ships, being deliberately sunk by their own crews. Over 50 Dutch ships were scuttled, destroyed by their own sailors in a desperate attempt to deny them to the Japanese invaders. The Dutch knew there was no saving Surabaya. The destroyer Witte de With, still afloat but badly damaged, was sunk. Gunboats, tugs, mine layers, converted freighters all sent to the bottom. Some of these ships were later raised by Japan and repaired. Most were gone forever, a final act of defiance before surrender. The last escape, running the gauntlet. What few ABDA ships remained were fleeing southeast toward Australia. This final group included 4 U.S. destroyers: John D. Edwards, John D. Ford, Paul Jones, Alden, several smaller crafts and auxiliaries, and they were being hunted at every turn. On March 2 inches, the Bali Strait, they ran into a Japanese destroyer group, Hatsuharu, Nanohi, Wakaba, and Hatsushimo. For 30 minutes, the American destroyers fought to break through, exchanged fire, deployed smoke, banked hard between coastline and reef, and somehow not a single shell struck them. They escaped into the open ocean, engines nearly failing, and finally reached Fremantle, Australia alive, barely. These were the only ABDA ships to make it out of the entire region. Death from above. Meanwhile, Japan's air and carrier fleets were still targeting Allied escapees. USS Langley, a seaplane tender carrying aircraft for Java, was caught by Japanese bombers on February 27, bombed into oblivion, scuttled by her crew. USS Pecos, a fleet tanker, was sunk the same day by land-based bombers. USS Edsall, a destroyer, was hunted by aircraft from Soryu and gunfire from Tone and Chikuma. She went down in pieces ablaze. Even freighters and support ships suffered. The Dutch Mojokerto sunk by Isokazi, the Spielman captured, the Engano and Tomohon gone. Avon hospital ships weren't safe. The Chilajap massacre. In one of the last disasters in the region, a Japanese cruiser squadron, including Takao, Atago, Maya, Nowaki, and Darashi, launched a multi-day raiding mission near Chilajap. Between March 1 and 4, they hunted and destroyed over 15 ships. It was mass slaughter. Pillsbury, Stronghold, Asheville sunk. Asterisk sloop HMAS Yara, oil tanker Frankel, supply ship Anking destroyed. Even minesweepers M3 and M51 were chased down and hit. And unlike earlier battles, there was no resistance, only ships trying to run. Most never had a chance. End of the line. By March 9, Japan controlled the Dutch East Indies. ABDA was completely erased. The Dutch government in exile would never again rule their colony directly. Australia was now Japan's southern neighbor, and the Allies, for a time, had surrendered all control of Southeast Asia. The Java Sea had become a graveyard. Section 6. Lights out in the East Indies. By March 10, 1942, the lights had gone dark across the Dutch East Indies. There were no more Allied warships in its waters. No convoys, no patrols, no resistance left afloat. Java had fallen. The ports were silent. The last radio transmissions went quiet. The once proud multinational navy known as ABDA America, Britain, the Dutch, and Australia was over. Not defeated, but erased. With the conquest of Java, the Japanese Empire controlled one of the most oil-rich territories in the world. At the time, the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, ranked 4th globally in oil production. It wasn't just strategic, it was symbolic. Oil, rubber, tin, raw materials. For a Japan starved by embargoes and determined to fuel its expansion, this victory wasn't optional, it was critical. Their war machine now had the fuel it needed. And the Allies? They were left reeling. Months earlier, the Western powers dominated Southeast Asian waters. British battleships patrolled Malaya. Dutch ships guarded Indonesia. US subs ran patrols near the Philippines. In just 10 weeks, that entire system had collapsed. On the 9th of March 1942, the Commander-in-Chief of Allied forces in Java, British Lieutenant General Hein ter Poorten, surrendered. There was no choice. Japanese troops were pouring into cities. Airfields had fallen, communications were cut, troop morale was gone. But the Japanese didn't stop with surrender. They immediately rounded up hundreds of thousands of Allied troops, Dutch colonials, and Indonesian civilians. Many were sent to prison camps, others executed without trial. Map after map was redrawn. The Dutch would never again reclaim full control of their colony. Indonesia had been captured. And a seed of revolution was planted that would eventually grow, decades later, into independence. What's shocking isn't just how quickly it happened, but how quietly this entire campaign faded into history. The Battle of the Java Sea was one of the largest and final true naval engagements of its kind, surface warships going toe-to-toe in open waters. And yet, it's barely remembered. There were no cameras on board, no global headlines, only blood-stained logs, radio transcripts, and long-forgotten last words of brave sailors who vanished beneath the sea. Why? Because there was no victory on the Allied side to retell. Most crews died, most ships were lost. And once the dust settled, Pacific strategy moved on to Midway, Guadalcanal, Coral Sea. The battles that came next would dominate attention. Java became a footnote. Historians today agree the Abda fleet was doomed from the beginning. It wasn't a fighting force, it was a desperate patchwork of leftovers. Outdated ships pulled from multiple navies, different tactics, different command structures, severe language barriers, Dutch signals missed by American crews, British formations misaligned with Australian ships, and worst of all, no time to train together. They were handed a suicide mission, stop Japan's unstoppable invasion, and told to figure the rest out themselves. To this day, many believe that Abda wasn't designed to win. It was designed to delay, to hold out just long enough for reinforcements that never came. So what changed? A lot. With Java lost, Japan now sat on Australia's doorstep. And this wasn't just paranoia. In February 1942, Japan launched the first ever air raid on the Australian mainland in Darwin, destroying its naval base and crippling regional coordination. The fall of Java meant the Allies could no longer project naval power across Southeast Asia. Singapore had already fallen. The Philippines would soon collapse. The US fleet had been humiliated at Pearl Harbor 2 months earlier. Japan now controlled Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and portions of New Guinea, all within 3 months. The Pacific had fallen under shadow. Legacy of Dorman's fleet. Today, Admiral Karel Dorman is remembered as both a hero and a tragedy. He knew his fleet was inadequate. He knew the Japanese ships were stronger, faster, more coordinated, and better equipped. He knew he wouldn't come back from that mission. Still, he sailed into fire. He became a symbol of resistance, courage, and futility. His final words, "I am attacking," became immortalized on Dutch war memorials. But there's a bitter mystery that still haunts his legacy. The fleet he died commanding vanished. By the early 2000s, divers began searching for the remains of the Java Sea battles. They discovered the wrecks of De Ruyter, Java, Electra, Exeter, Encounter, Pope, all resting on the seafloor, some preserved, others mangled by torpedoes and fire. But in 2016, an international team returned to those same coordinates and made a chilling discovery. The wrecks were gone, not shifted, not deepened, just missing, scavenged. Entire warships, some over 500 feet long, illegally salvaged, likely cut up for scrap and sold for parts. Gravestones turned into profit. To this day, no one has been held accountable. Even Dorman's flagship, De Ruyter, vanished from the ocean floor without any trace. In the end, even the graves of these sailors weren't spared. The destruction of the Abda fleet was a defining moment of World War II, but not because of victory, tactics, or heroism. It mattered because, for one stunning, fatal week, the Allies saw what Japan was truly capable of. The speed, the discipline, the coordination, and above all, the ruthlessness. Abda was the cost of underestimation, and the world learned fast. From the wreckage of Java came a shift in Allied strategy. Australia reinforced its northern coasts. The US changed its Pacific command model. British naval policy refocused on long-distance sea lanes. And as Japan advanced, the memory of Java haunted every Allied fleet until the tide finally turned at Midway. To this day, few people know the full story of the Java Sea. Fewer can name the men who died. Entire ships, hundreds of lives disappeared, not just beneath the sea, but from the history books entirely. There was no rescue, no grand victory, only the grim silence of ships that went down fighting. What would have happened if Abda had won? Would Japan's expansion have slowed? Would Java have been spared? Or was this fleet always meant to suffer so that the world could finally see how dangerous the rising sun had become? Sometimes, loss teaches more than victory ever can. If you found this story powerful or eye-opening, consider subscribing. This is just one of countless hidden battles lost to history, and we're uncovering them one by one. What story should we tell next? Drop a comment. And if you want the full multi-part breakdown with maps, wreck footage, and original survivor accounts, check the description. Until next time, stay curious and stay bold.